The September rain drummed against the church windows as I watched them lower Grandpa's casket into the Missouri soil. Everyone said he lived a good life, 87 years of farming, raising cattle, and watching his grandchildren grow. But standing there in my black suit, feeling like a stranger among my own family, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Uncle Martin and Uncle David flanked my father, their faces appropriately somber. They'd driven in from the city the night before their expensive cars, looking out of place next to the pickup trucks in the church parking lot. I hadn't seen much of them over the years. They'd left the farming life behind decades ago, pursuing careers in law and real estate respectively. I glanced at my father Richard standing silently between his brothers. He'd stayed on the farm with Grandpa, but never with the same passion. While Grandpa taught me to read the soil and sky, Dad seemed caught between worlds, not ambitious enough to leave like his brothers, not committed enough to embrace the life fully. The last conversation I'd had with Grandpa replayed in my mind, his weathered hand gripping mine with surprising strength as he whispered, "This land knows your hands better than anyone's, Jamie." At 25, fresh out of agricultural college, I'd been ready to put my education to work alongside him. Now I stood watching his dreams buried with him. After the service, we gathered at Grandpa's farmhouse, the same house where I'd spent countless summers learning to milk cows and fix fence posts. Now it felt different, heavy with unspoken tension. My uncles moved through the rooms with calculating eyes, examining furniture and fixtures with thinly veiled appraisal. The kitchen overflowed with casserole dishes and desserts brought by neighbors. Sarah Mitchell, our closest neighbor for over 25 years, pressed a warm pie into my hands. Her border collie waited patiently on the porch where he'd spent many evenings while Sarah and Grandpa discussed weather patterns and crop rotations. "We need to discuss the estate," Uncle Martin announced over coffee, his lawyer's voice cutting through the quiet conversations. The will was clear. The farm gets divided equally among the three sons. I looked at my father, expecting him to say something, but he just nodded quietly. That's when I noticed Uncle David removing papers from Grandpa's old roll-top desk, stuffing them into his briefcase with casual efficiency. "What about Jamie?" my father finally asked, gesturing toward me. "Dad always said the farm would stay in the family," I added, remembering countless conversations where Grandpa spoke about me taking over. "The farm will stay in the family," Uncle Martin replied smoothly. "We'll keep it for a few years. Maybe lease it out, then decide what's best. Jamie can visit whenever they want." Visit, like I'd be a tourist in the place that had shaped me more than any other. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. Uncle Martin continued outlining his plans, rational, practical plans that treated the farm like an investment property rather than a living legacy. I watched the faces of the farmers who'd known Grandpa for decades. Pete Murphy from the feed store frowned into his coffee cup. The Andersons exchanged glances. They knew what this meant. Another family farm swallowed up another piece of agricultural heritage lost. 3 days after the funeral, I returned to the farmhouse alone. My uncles had gone back to their city lives, leaving me to help sort through Dad's things, as they put it. The house felt impossibly quiet without Grandpa's presence. No morning coffee brewing at 500 a.m., no evening news playing on the old television, no creaking floorboards as he made his nightly rounds checking doors and windows. I wandered through the rooms, each one holding a lifetime of memories. The kitchen where Grandma had taught me to make biscuits before she passed 10 years ago. The living room where Grandpa and I would plan the next season's crops over glasses of sweet tea. The front porch where we'd sit in the evenings watching fireflies dance over the pastures. Everything felt frozen in time, yet somehow already slipping away. I could see my uncle's influence everywhere. Furniture moved drawers, rifled through family photos, mysteriously absent from their usual spots. They'd worked fast, I'd give them that. In Grandpa's bedroom, I found his old cedar chest open, its contents scattered. Letters, photographs, his military medals from Korea, all mixed together like someone had been searching for something specific. I carefully sorted through everything, trying to restore some order to the chaos my uncles had left behind. That's when I found the insurance papers showing fire damage to the barn from 15 years ago. The same fire where Uncle Martin claimed the original will had been destroyed. Convenient timing, considering it happened just 2 months after my uncles had visited for what they called a family business meeting. I studied the insurance documents more closely. The fire had been contained to the south end of the barn, the equipment area. But Grandpa kept important papers in a filing cabinet in the North End workshop. The report noted no damage to that section. Something didn't add up. I'd been away at college, then focused on my studies and completely unaware of any family drama. But now looking at those insurance documents, I began to wonder what else I might have missed. What conversations had taken place in this house while I was gone? What decisions had been made without me? More troubling was the fire chief's report tucked behind the insurance claim. He'd noted possible accelerant use recommended further investigation. Yet the follow-up page showed the case closed with no additional inquiry. Uncle Martin's law firm letterhead appeared on the correspondence that concluded the matter. A knock at the door pulled me from these thoughts. Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch, her border collie sitting obediently at her feet. The evening light caught the silver in her hair. "I brought some dinner," she said, holding up a covered dish. "Thought you might not be taking time to eat properly." I welcomed her in, grateful for the company and the break from my unsettling discoveries. Sarah had been farming her adjacent property single-handedly since her husband died 12 years ago. She'd been a paralegal before retiring to farm full-time, and her practical knowledge had been a resource for Grandpa on more than one occasion. "I've been seeing your uncles here several times over the past year," she remarked as we sat on the front porch. "Usually when you weren't around. They drive up in those fancy cars, stay for a few hours, then leave looking pretty satisfied with themselves." Her words confirmed my growing suspicion. "Did Grandpa ever say anything to you about them?" "About the farm?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "He was worried. Said they'd been asking too many questions about land values and tax assessments. Started keeping more things under lock and key after their visits. Not like your grandfather at all. He was always an open book." The border collie's ears perked up, and we turned to see headlights coming up the long driveway. My father's truck pulled up, gravel crunching under the tires. Sarah squeezed my shoulder as she stood to leave. "Your grandfather was proud of you, Jamie. Remember that?" Dad looked tired as he climbed the porch steps, the weight of grief and something else, guilt perhaps, etched on his face. We sat in the gathering darkness, the only sound, the creak of the porch swing and the chirping of crickets. "Martin says we should have the equipment appraised next week," he finally said. "David already has a contact interested in the acreage near the highway. They're moving fast," I observed, watching his reaction carefully. "They've always been efficient," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "Did Grandpa ever talk to you about his will?" "The real one?" His head snapped up. "What do you mean?" I showed him the insurance documents, explained my suspicions about the fire and the convenient timing. His face grew increasingly pale. "Dad, I think they destroyed Grandpa's will and replaced it with one that suited them better. And I think you might have known something about it." His hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee mug. "They said it was best for everyone. The farm needs money, not sentiment. We're all getting older, Jamie. None of us can work this land like your grandfather did. But I can," I insisted. "That's why I went to agricultural college. Grandpa and I had plans for this place. Plans don't pay mortgages." My father's voice hardened. "Martin has been helping me manage my finances for years. Without him, I'd have lost my share of everything long ago." The pieces clicked into place. My father's mysterious weekend trips to the city, his new truck when the farm supposedly couldn't afford equipment upgrades, his reluctance to discuss future plans for the property. He wasn't just passively going along with his brothers, he was financially entangled with them. "So you knew they were planning to sell, even though Grandpa wanted me to have it." He stared out at the darkened fields. "I didn't know they'd destroy the will. But yes, I knew they wanted to sell eventually. Land this close to the highway will be worth millions with the right zoning changes. Martin has connections." The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. Not just my uncle's, but my own father. The one person who should have protected Grandpa's wishes. Protected my future. "I need some time alone," I told him, standing abruptly. "The farmhouse is feeling pretty crowded with all these secrets." Dad reached for my arm, his fingers closing around my wrist with unexpected desperation. "You don't understand what Martin is capable of when he doesn't get his way. He's not just your uncle, he's got powerful friends, investments that need to pay off. There's more at stake here than you realize." The fear in his eyes made my stomach tighten. Was he warning me or threatening me? I pulled away, retreating to the safety of the house, locking the door behind me. That night, I double-checked every window, every entrance. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my childhood home, unsure who I could trust. Morning brought no clarity, only a deepening resolve to uncover the truth. I called in sick to my part-time job at the Agricultural Extension Office, knowing I needed every hour to investigate what my uncles had done. The rain that had accompanied Grandpa's funeral returned drumming against the roof and windows, turning the farm roads to mud. It matched my mood perfectly, gray, unsettled, threatening. I started with Grandpa's office, methodically going through every drawer, every folder, looking for anything that might have been overlooked in my uncle's hasty search. Most of the papers were farm-related equipment manuals, seed catalogs, rainfall records, going back decades. Grandpa believed in keeping track of patterns, always saying that the past was the best predictor of future yields. Under a stack of agricultural journals, I found a small leather-bound book. Its pages filled with Grandpa's neat handwriting. It wasn't a diary, exactly, more like a record of important events. I flipped to entries from around the time of the barn fire. Martin and David visited today, talked about estate planning, tax advantages of selling portions of the land. Told them I'm not interested. This farm stays intact for Jamie. They didn't like that answer. 2 weeks later, found someone had been through my filing cabinet. Nothing missing but papers rearranged, changed the lock on the office door. And then just after the date of the fire, don't believe it was an accident. Too convenient. Filing cabinet undamaged but well missing. Martin suggested using this as opportunity to modernize estate planning. Said old will was outdated anyway. Don't trust him. Reading Grandpa's private thoughts sent a chill through me. He'd suspected his own sons of sabotage, of deliberately destroying his will. Yet he'd never confronted them directly, never reported his suspicions. Why was it simply a father's reluctance to believe the worst of his children, or something more complicated? I continued searching, moving to areas my uncles might have overlooked. In the kitchen, behind Grandma's old recipe books, I found a file of bank statements. Unlike the meticulous records in Grandpa's office, these seemed randomly preserved, as if he'd stashed them hastily. Most were routine farm expenses, equipment purchases, tax payments. But one caught my eye, a series of transfers from Martin's personal account to Grandpa's labeled as consulting fees. The amounts were substantial, starting about 2 years ago and continuing until just before Grandpa's death. Why would Martin be paying Grandpa? If anything, I'd expect financial support to flow in the opposite direction. I set the statements aside, adding them to my growing pile of evidence. Next came the attic access through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. The space was stifling in the late summer heat, dust motes dancing in the beams of light from the small dormer windows. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old clothes, and childhood toys lined the rafters. In the farthest corner, partially hidden by a rolled-up rug, stood a metal lockbox. The key was missing, but a farming upbringing teaches practical solutions. 10 minutes with a screwdriver and hammer had the latch sprung. Inside were more documents, old deeds to the property, the original land grant from the 1880s, my grandparents' marriage certificate. At the bottom lay a folder labeled Highway Development Proposal. Inside was correspondence between Martin and a development company called Midwest Growth Partners. The letters discussed the potential acquisition of prime highway-adjacent agricultural land in our county, with specific mention of the Peterson property as a key component of their plans. The most recent letter, dated just 2 months before Grandpa's death, mentioned anticipated availability within the calendar year and removal of potential succession obstacles. The clinical language couldn't disguise the meaning. They were waiting for Grandpa to be confident that the farm would then be available for development. Martin wasn't just planning to sell the farm after Grandpa's death. He'd been actively negotiating its sale while Grandpa was still alive, while I was still planning my future here. The betrayal took on new dimensions, the calculation more cold-blooded than I'd imagined. I photographed every document with my phone, creating digital backups of everything I found. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be caught without evidence. The rain continued throughout the day, sometimes slacking to a drizzle, sometimes strengthening to a downpour that obscured the view of the barns from the house. By late afternoon, I needed a break from the emotional toll of discovering layer after layer of family deception. I decided to check the livestock, pulling on Grandpa's old rain slicker that still hung by the back door. The familiar smell of canvas and farm dust brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The muddy path to the barn sucked at my boots, making each step an effort. Water dripped from the brim of my hat, running in cold rivulets down my neck. The cattle huddled under the shelter of the run-in shed, their breath creating steam in the chilly air. I counted heads by habit, ensuring all were present and showing no signs of distress. Inside the main barn, the smell of hay and livestock brought a comfort that papers and documents couldn't provide. This was real, tangible, the life Grandpa had built, the legacy he'd wanted to pass on. Not just land and buildings, but a way of living, a connection to something enduring. The barn had been rebuilt after the fire, but the workshop section retained its original structure. The sturdy oak beams blackened with age. This was where Grandpa spent winter evenings repairing equipment, where he'd taught me to change tractor oil and sharpen plow blades. On my fourth day in the house, I decided to tackle Grandpa's workshop in the basement. He'd always been meticulous about his tools and supplies, and everything labeled and organized with the precision of a man who'd spent decades making the most of what he had. The workshop smelled of motor oil, leather, and the earthy scent of seeds and fertilizer. I started with the workbench, sorting through coffee cans full of screws and nails, old catalogs for farm equipment, and hand-drawn plans for various building projects. Grandpa was old school. He preferred to sketch his ideas on paper rather than use computer programs. Each drawing showed his careful attention to detail and his deep understanding of practical engineering. Along the far wall stood a series of wooden drawers he'd built himself, each one labeled with faded masking tape: corn seeds, bean seeds, tomato seeds, flower seeds. I'd helped him organize these drawers every spring preparing for planting season. Even though it was September, I found myself checking each drawer out of habit, making sure everything was still properly stored. The corn seed drawer stuck when I tried to open it, warped slightly from years of basement humidity. I had to work it back and forth several times before it finally gave way with a sharp crack. Seeds scattered across the floor, and I cursed under my breath, dropping to my knees to gather them up. That's when I saw it, a manila envelope taped to the underside of the drawer, yellowed with age and partially hidden by accumulated dust. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully removed the tape and pulled the envelope free. It was heavier than I expected, and when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were legal documents, all bearing Grandpa's signature and official seals. The top document was labeled Last Will and Testament of Thomas Harold Peterson, dated just 3 years ago, 2 years after the supposed fire that destroyed the original will. But this wasn't the will my uncles had read at the lawyer's office. This will told a completely different story. According to this document, Grandpa had left the entire farm, all 847 acres, the house, the barns, the equipment, and the livestock, to me. Not divided among his 3 sons, but specifically and exclusively to my grandchild, who has shown the dedication, knowledge, and love for the land that this farm deserves. The will was detailed and specific, listing every asset down to the vintage tractor I'd learned to drive when I was 12. But more importantly, it included a handwritten letter attached to the back in Grandpa's unmistakable script. Jamie, if you're reading this, then something has happened to the will I filed with my lawyer in town. I've suspected for some time that Martin and David have been pressuring your father to sell the farm once I'm gone. They see dollar signs where we see home. I won't let that happen. This land has been in our family for 4 generations, and it deserves to stay with someone who understands its value beyond money. You've got farming in your blood, just like your great-grandfather did. Don't let them take this from you. The letter was dated 6 months ago, and reading it felt like having one final conversation with Grandpa. I could almost hear his voice, steady and certain, the way he sounded when he was teaching me about crop rotation or explaining why we needed to check the fence line after every storm. But along with the relief of knowing Grandpa's true intentions came a cold realization about what my uncles had done. They hadn't just misplaced the original will or suffered an unfortunate accident with a barn fire. They had deliberately destroyed it and replaced it with a forgery that served their interests. I sat in that dusty basement for nearly an hour processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about family legacy and the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any physical wound. My uncles had looked me in the eye, at the funeral had listened to me talk about my plans for the farm, knowing they intended to steal it all along. I carefully replaced the seeds in the drawer, making sure nothing looked disturbed. The envelope with the will went into my jacket pocket close to my heart. I needed to get it somewhere safe, somewhere my uncles couldn't find it if they realized what I'd discovered. Upstairs, the phone rang, startling me. I hesitated before answering, suddenly wary of every contact, every conversation. Jamie, Uncle Martin's voice smooth and controlled. How's the inventory coming along? Still working on it, I replied, keeping my tone neutral, despite the anger burning in my chest. Lots to go through. Well, don't worry about the equipment. We've arranged for an appraiser to come out tomorrow. Professional service, very thorough. They'll want access to the barn sheds, everything. My mind raced. They were moving faster than I'd anticipated, already beginning the process of cataloging and valuing assets. Once appraised, how long before they started selling? I won't be here tomorrow, I lied. Got to cover a shift at the extension office. Can we reschedule a pause, brief but noticeable? This isn't really optional, Jamie. The estate process has timelines, legal requirements. We need to move things along. The will said the property would be divided equally, I said, testing him. But nothing about immediate liquidation. Isn't there a waiting period after probate? Another pause, longer this time. Has someone been giving you legal advice? Because that would be premature. The estate matters are being handled by professionals. Your father has already signed the necessary paperwork. The implication was clear. The decisions had been made, the process set in motion. I was expected to step aside and let it happen. I'll try to reschedule my shift, I conceded, not wanting to provoke further suspicion, but I'd like to be present for the appraisal. Of course, Martin replied, his voice relaxing slightly. It's important for you to understand the process. We all want what's best for the family. After hanging up, I paced the kitchen, anxiety building with each step. They were closing in methodically, dismantling Grandpa's life's work. I needed help, needed guidance on what to do next. I spent the next 2 days going through every document in the house with forensic precision. If I was going to challenge my uncles, I needed more than just a copy of the real will. I needed proof of their deception. Grandpa had always been meticulous with his record keeping, and I prayed that habit would serve me now. In his filing cabinet, I found correspondence with his lawyer, Harold Brennan, dating back 15 years. The letter showed a clear pattern. Grandpa had updated his will 3 times over the years, each time becoming more specific about leaving the farm to me. The last letter, dated 8 months ago, explicitly mentioned his concerns about his son's intentions and his decision to keep a copy of the will in a safe place they'd never think to look. He'd known they were coming for the farm. He'd been preparing for this battle even before I realized one was brewing. I also found bank records showing several large cash deposits Uncle Martin had made into Grandpa's account over the past 2 years, always with memos like estate planning consultation or legal advice fee. It seemed he'd been positioning himself as Grandpa's financial advisor, gaining access to sensitive information about the estate. Most damning was a folder tucked behind other files containing photocopies of correspondence between Uncle Martin and a law firm in Kansas City. The letters discussed asset protection strategies and will modification procedures in language clearly designed to circumvent Grandpa's actual wishes. The more I discovered, the more elaborate the deception appeared. This wasn't a spontaneous decision after Grandpa's death. This was a calculated plan, years in the making, a patient waiting game with millions of dollars at stake. My first call was to Harold Brennan's office. His secretary had informed me that he'd retired suddenly 3 months ago, citing health issues. When I asked for his forwarding address, she claimed she wasn't authorized to provide that information. The timing of his retirement, so close to Grandpa's death, seemed awfully convenient. I decided to drive into town and start asking questions in person. At Murphy's feed store, I struck gold. Old Pete Murphy had been selling supplies to area farmers for 50 years, and he remembered several conversations with Grandpa about his plans for the farm. Your granddad was proud as punch about you taking over, Pete told me, as we stood among stacked feed bags. Said you had more farming sense in your little finger than his boys had in their whole bodies. He was worried about them, though. Said they'd been asking too many questions about land values and tax assessments. Did he ever mention his lawyer, Harold Brennan? Pete's expression darkened. Funny business there. Harold's been the county's go-to for wills and estates since before I took over the store from my daddy. Never known him to retire without a proper goodbye to folks. Just up and disappeared. His wife told my cousin they're moving to Arizona, but Harold hates the heat. Always said so. The mystery deepened. A respected local attorney suddenly abandoning his practice. A convenient barn fire. a will that contradicted decades of stated intentions, financial transactions with no clear purpose. Each piece pointed to a deliberate effort to subvert Grandpa's wishes. Word travels fast in small farming communities, and by my sixth day back, several neighbors had stopped by to check on me and share their own suspicions about my uncle's sudden interest in the farm. The Andersons, whose property bordered ours to the north, mentioned seeing surveyors on our land just weeks before Grandpa's death. Old Bill Jackson, who'd shared equipment with Grandpa for 30 years, reported a conversation where Martin had casually inquired about the value of our newer tractor. Even Pastor Lewis from the Methodist Church dropped by, ostensibly to offer condolences, but actually to ask pointedly about the rumors of development he'd been hearing. The most helpful visitor was Sarah Mitchell, who returned with a determined look in her eye and a folder tucked under her arm. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said, as we sat on the front porch, her border collie chasing squirrels in the yard. "I kept some notes from my paralegal days about estate cases, thought they might be useful." She spread the papers on the porch table, her former professional demeanor returning, as she explained the legal implications of what I'd discovered. "This document looks legitimate," she said, examining the copied will carefully and noting the official seals and witness signatures. "The question is whether you can prove the will your uncles presented was falsified. That's going to require expert analysis, maybe even forensic examination." "What about Harold Brennan?" I asked. "He was Grandpa's lawyer for decades. He'd know which will was real." Sarah's expression turned troubled. "I tried calling Barbara Brennan last week. Their house is up for sale. Neighbors said they left in a hurry, barely packed. It's not like Harold to abandon clients without proper arrangements for their files. Do you think my uncle could have pressured him?" Somehow Sarah chose her words carefully. "Martin has quite a reputation in legal circles. Very effective, very persistent when he wants something. And he has connections with the disciplinary board that oversees attorney conduct." She offered to make some calls to legal contacts from her former career people who specialized in estate disputes and document authentication. More importantly, she offered to serve as a character witness testifying to Grandpa's repeated statements about leaving the farm to me. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call. The woman identified herself as Martha Harold Brennan's former secretary. She'd gotten my number from Sarah, who apparently knew her from church. Martha sounded nervous, but determined to share what she knew. "Mr. Brennan didn't retire because of health problems," she whispered into the phone. "Your Uncle Martin pressured him to close his practice after your grandfather died, made some threats about reporting him to the state bar for various supposed violations. Harold was scared. He's 73 years old and didn't want to fight." She arranged to meet me the next day at a coffee shop in the county seat, away from prying eyes and listening ears. When we met, Martha brought a briefcase containing copies of all the documents related to Grandpa's estate that she'd managed to save before Martin forced the office closure. "Your grandfather came to see Mr. Brennan 6 months before he died," she explained over coffee and pie. "He was agitated, said he suspected someone had been going through his papers at home. He wanted to make sure his real will was properly filed and couldn't be tampered with." The documents she showed me included a copy of the original will identical to the one I'd found in the seed drawer, along with Harold Brennan's detailed notes about Grandpa's concerns regarding his son's intentions. "I made these copies because something felt wrong." Martha confided, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed the files toward me. "The day after your grandfather's death, your Uncle Martin showed up at the office. He had a document he claimed was Thomas's last will, demanded Harold file it for probate immediately. When Harold objected, said it didn't match the will in our records, Martin got frightening, said he'd have Harold's license if he didn't cooperate. What happened then, Harold has a heart condition. The stress was too much. He agreed to retire and turn his practice over to a younger attorney Martin recommended. I was let go the same day, but not before I secured these copies. I couldn't just let them erase your grandfather's wishes." Martha's voice lowered as she slid a business card across the table. "Elena Rodriguez. She's the best estate attorney in the state capital. Tell her I sent you and she'll understand the urgency." As I drove back to the farm, the gravity of what I was undertaking settled over me. I was preparing to go to war with my own family to accuse them publicly of fraud and deception. There would be no coming back from this, no happy family reunions in the future. But when I thought of Grandpa's letter of his trust in me to protect the land he loved, I knew I had no choice. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance. I was fighting for 4 generations of Peterson farmers whose sweat and blood had nurtured this soil, for the community that depended on family farms like ours to maintain their way of life, for the promise I'd made to Grandpa long before I knew how difficult it would be to keep. The rain finally stopped as I turned onto our long gravel driveway. The setting sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the farmhouse and barns in golden light. The fields stretched out on either side, the corn nearly ready for harvest, the soybeans turning from green to gold. This view had greeted generations of Petersons returning home, my great-grandfather, after the devastation of the Dust Bowl years, my grandfather returning from Korea, my father coming back from failed attempts at city living. Now it welcomed me not just as a visitor or helper, but as the rightful inheritor of everything it represented. Tomorrow I would call Elena Rodriguez. Tomorrow I would begin the legal battle to honor Grandpa's wishes. Tonight I would walk the boundaries of the land, reconnecting with every field and fence line, reminding myself what I was fighting for. Just before reaching the farmhouse, I pulled over at the crest of the hill that overlooked the entire property. From here I could see the original homestead built by my great-grandfather, the barn my grandfather had raised after a tornado destroyed the previous one, the orchard where I'd learned to climb trees, and the pen where I'd caught my first fish. This wasn't just land, it was the physical embodiment of my family's story, a legacy written in furrows and fences. I made a silent promise to the generations of Petersons who had worked this soil. I will not let them take this from us. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, this farm will remain what it has always been, a place where the past and future meet in perfect harmony. Armed with that promise, I drove down the hill toward the battle that awaited me. The next morning, I called Elena Rodriguez and scheduled an appointment for later that day. I couldn't risk waiting any longer. The wheels of my uncle's plans were already turning, appraisers, potential buyers, legal maneuvers I couldn't begin to anticipate. Elena's receptionist, hearing Martha's name, immediately put me through. "This needs to be handled carefully," Elena warned, after I explained my situation. "People who forge wills and intimidate elderly lawyers won't hesitate to take more drastic measures when millions of dollars are at stake. Document everything. And don't discuss this with anyone you don't completely trust." Her warning sent a chill through me. I'd been viewing this as a family dispute, albeit a serious one. But Elena's words reframed it as something potentially dangerous. These weren't just my uncles anymore. They were men who had committed crimes and would likely commit more to protect themselves. Before leaving for the state capitol, I took precautions. I carefully photographed every document I'd found, uploading the images to a secure cloud account, as Martha had suggested. I placed the physical copy of the will in a waterproof container and buried it beneath the old oak tree where Grandpa and I had often sat to escape the summer heat. No fire, accidental or otherwise, would destroy this evidence. The drive to Elena's office took nearly 2 hours, giving me time to organize my thoughts. The Missouri countryside rolled past my window, family farms, interspersed with subdivisions and strip malls, the slow transformation of rural America playing out mile by mile. How many of these farms had already been lost to development? How many families had been torn apart by the same pressures now threatening mine? Elena's office occupied the top floor of a sleek building, a far cry from Harold Brennan's modest practice in our small town. Elena herself was younger than I expected, perhaps early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She reviewed the documents I'd brought, asking detailed questions and taking extensive notes. "This is a strong case," she concluded after nearly 2 hours. "Document forgery, destruction of legal documents, fraud. These are serious charges. The challenge will be proving everything in court, especially since they've destroyed the original will and intimidated key witnesses." She explained that estate litigation could be expensive and time-consuming, potentially taking years to resolve fully. Meanwhile, my uncles would likely try to sell off farm assets or find other ways to complicate the legal process. "Our first step is an emergency injunction to prevent any sale or disposal of farm assets until the court can determine the will's validity. That will buy us time to build our case properly. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We're looking at a lengthy battle. Your uncles won't back down easily, not with this much money at stake. I'll need a significant retainer," she warned. "Estate cases like this aren't cheap." My heart sank. I had some savings, but nowhere near enough for a prolonged legal battle against well-connected opponents like Uncle Martin. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the message, then looked at me with new interest. It seems your retainer has already been paid, she said. In full. I stared at her in confusion. By whom? The payment came from the Peterson Family Farm Protection Trust, she explained, showing me the notification on her screen. Established 6 months ago by Thomas Peterson. A wave of emotion washed over me. Even from beyond the grave, Grandpa was still fighting for the farm for me. He hadn't just hidden a copy of his will, he'd set aside funds to defend it. He'd anticipated everything. Grandpa knew them better than I thought, I whispered, fighting back tears. He saw this coming a mile away. Elena's expression softened momentarily before returning to professional efficiency. Your grandfather was clearly a prudent man. Now let's honor his foresight by using these resources effectively. She outlined our strategy. First, secure the emergency injunction. Second, depose key witnesses, including Harold Brennan, if we could locate him. Third, gather expert testimony about the authenticity of both wills. Throughout, we would need to document every action my uncles took regarding the farm and its assets. Leave the legal maneuvers to me, she instructed, handing me a small notebook. Your job is to be my eyes and ears on the ground. Record everything: conversations, visitors to the property, any changes to the farm or its operations. No detail is too small. As I drove back to the farm that evening, the setting sun painted the Missouri fields in shades of gold. The corn stood tall and proud, nearly ready for harvest. The cattle grazed peacefully in the western pasture. This land had sustained my family for generations. It had taught me patience, responsibility, and respect for things greater than myself. I wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. I had Grandpa's foresight, Sarah's wisdom, Martha's courage, and Elena's expertise. I had a community of farmers who understood what was at stake. And most importantly, I had the truth documented, witnessed and hidden where my uncles would never think to look. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of vehicles coming up the driveway. Through my bedroom window, I watched a procession of unfamiliar cars approach the house. Uncle Martin's Mercedes led the way, followed by what appeared to be the promised appraisers, men in business casual attire carrying clipboards and cameras. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, determined to monitor their activities. Uncle Martin stood in the kitchen, issuing instructions to the appraisal team with the confidence of someone who already owned everything they were evaluating. Jamie, he greeted me with practiced warmth that never reached his eyes. Hope we didn't wake you. Thought we'd get an early start. These gentlemen need to inventory the equipment, livestock, and outbuildings. Standard procedure. I'm coming with them, I replied, pouring myself coffee while watching his reaction. A slight tightening around his mouth betrayed his displeasure. That's not necessary. These are professionals, very thorough. You'd just be wasting your time. I insisted politely but firmly, recalling Elena's advice to document everything without revealing my suspicions. I'd like to learn about the process. After all, it's my heritage too. Martin couldn't argue without seeming unreasonable, so he conceded with obvious reluctance. As you wish, but please don't interfere with their work. Time is money. I followed the appraisal team as they moved from building to building, noting with growing concern how they focused almost exclusively on newer, more valuable equipment. They photographed the tractors, combines, and irrigation systems, but barely glanced at older implements that, while less valuable on paper, were essential to day-to-day operations. Their livestock assessment was equally troubling. They counted heads but paid little attention to breeding records or the careful genetics Grandpa had cultivated over decades. To them, a cow was a cow worth only its weight in beef. One appraiser, younger than the others, fell behind as we walked between barns. Noticing my frustration, he spoke quietly. Look, I can see you care about this place, but you should know this isn't a standard farm appraisal. We've been instructed to prioritize items with immediate resale value, equipment that can be moved quickly, livestock that can go straight to auction. Who instructed you? I asked, already suspecting the answer. He glanced toward Martin, who was speaking on his phone near the house. Your uncle made it very clear what they're looking for. I've done plenty of farm valuations, and this isn't how we usually operate. This is, I don't know, it feels more like liquidation preparation than estate valuation. His candor confirmed my fears. They weren't just appraising the farm, they were preparing to dismantle it piece by piece. I thanked him for his honesty and continued the tour, making detailed notes in the book Elena had given me, recording every item they examined and every comment they made. By midday, Uncle David arrived, parking his BMW next to Martin's Mercedes. The contrast between their luxury vehicles and the working farm equipment surrounding them couldn't have been more stark. David looked uncomfortable, constantly checking his phone and avoiding eye contact with me. I approached him while Martin was occupied with the appraisal team leader. "Why the rush?" I asked without preamble. "The estate's barely entered probate. There's no need to start selling things off immediately." David flinched as if I'd raised a hand to him. "It's not my decision, Jamie. Martin says there are tax advantages to moving quickly, and the market conditions are favorable right now. But this isn't what Grandpa wanted. You know that, don't you?" His eyes darted toward Martin, then back to me. "What Thomas wanted isn't relevant anymore. The will is clear, and your father has agreed to the plan. The will you're using isn't the real one," I said quietly, watching his reaction carefully. His face paled visibly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I think you know exactly what happened to Grandpa's real will, the one that left the farm to me." Before he could respond, Martin called him over. David practically ran to his brother's side, leaving me alone with my growing certainty that I was right. David's guilty reaction had confirmed what the documents suggested. They knew they were executing a fraudulent will, and David at least had a conscience troubled by that knowledge. That evening, word of the appraiser's visit spread through the community. Sarah Mitchell called to check on me, and Pete Murphy stopped by with the transparent excuse of delivering feed supplements we hadn't ordered. "Those city suits were all over your place today," Pete observed, helping me stack the unnecessary bags in the storage shed. "Vultures circling before the body's even cold, if you ask me." I confirmed his assessment without revealing my legal plans. "Every farmer in the county has noticed," I told him. "The Andersons, the Jacksons, even Pastor Lewis mentioned it." Pete's weathered face creased with concern. "Your grandfather meant something to this community, Jamie. He was always the first to help when someone's barn burned down or when a neighbor needed extra hands during harvest. People remember that. They want to honor it." His words gave me an idea. The Peterson Harvest Festival was coming up in just 2 weeks, an annual tradition Grandpa had started 20 years earlier to celebrate the harvest and strengthen community bonds. In recent years, it had grown from a small gathering to a significant local event with dozens of farming families participating. "We're still having the festival, aren't we?" I asked Pete. "Even with Grandpa gone." He looked at me like I'd suggested canceling Christmas. "Course we are. Already got the tents reserved and the music booked. Your grandfather set everything in motion before he passed. Committee's just been waiting to confirm with you. I want to make it special this year," I decided. A proper tribute to Grandpa's legacy. As Pete left promising to spread the word about the festival, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The event would be more than a memorial. It would be a demonstration of community support, a public statement about the farm's importance beyond its real estate value. 2 days later, the legal battle began in earnest. Elena filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any sale or disposal of farm assets. The court scheduled a hearing for the following week, faster than I'd expected, but still giving my uncles plenty of time to maneuver. Martin's response was immediate and forceful. That evening, he called to inform me that I had 24 hours to vacate the farmhouse. "The property belongs to the estate now, not to you personally," he stated coldly. "As executor, I'm responsible for securing all assets. Your continued unsupervised presence presents a liability." "I've been living here my entire life," I protested. "I'm maintaining the property, caring for the livestock. Who's going to do that if I leave?" "We've arranged for a management service to handle day-to-day operations. They'll have someone on site by tomorrow afternoon." His tone left no room for negotiation, but I wasn't about to be intimidated. I called Elena, who assured me that Martin had no legal authority to evict me from the property while our challenge to the will was pending. "Stay put," she instructed. "If they try to force you out, physically call the sheriff. I'll email you a copy of our filing to show them. This is a classic intimidation tactic, and we're not going to fall for it." The next day, a truck from Midwest Agricultural Management Services arrived at the farm. 2 men in company polos introduced themselves as the new property managers, explaining that they'd been hired by the estate to oversee operations until the property was sold. I showed them Elena's documentation and explained that I would not be leaving, nor would I be turning over management of the farm. They seemed unsurprised by this development, suggesting that Martin had anticipated my resistance. "We'll report back to the company," one of them said with a shrug. "Not our problem if the clients can't get their story straight." After they left, I searched the company name online and discovered what I should have suspected Midwest Agricultural Management Services was a subsidiary of Midwest Growth Partners, the same development company that had been corresponding with Martin about purchasing the farm. They weren't farm managers. They were essentially property scouts evaluating the land for future development. The attempted eviction was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Martin escalated his efforts to assert control over the farm. The local bank called to inform me that access to the farm's operating accounts had been restricted. Only Martin, as executor, could approve expenditures. When I explained that we needed funds for livestock feed and essential maintenance, I was politely but firmly directed to submit formal requests through proper channels. Then the equipment problems began. The irrigation system mysteriously malfunctioned, threatening the late-season crops. The main tractor's fuel line was found cut one morning. A section of fence was discovered open, allowing several cattle to wander onto the highway before I could round them up. None of these incidents could be definitively linked to my uncles, but the pattern was clear. They were trying to demonstrate that I couldn't manage the farm effectively, creating problems that would justify their claim that the property needed professional oversight. Their oversight. I documented each incident meticulously, photographing the damage, recording dates and times, noting any suspicious vehicles or visitors to the property. Elena added these to our growing file of evidence, but cautioned that proving sabotage would be difficult without direct evidence or witnesses. Throughout this challenging period, the community's support became my lifeline. Neighboring farmers stopped by regularly offering help with repairs, lending equipment, when ours mysteriously failed, sharing supplies when our accounts were frozen. The Andersons brought fuel for the generators when the power to the barns was inexplicably cut. Bill Jackson helped mend fences and round up stray livestock. Sarah Mitchell kept watch on the property whenever I needed to leave her border collie, alerting her to any unusual visitors. Word spreads through farming communities, Pete Murphy told me when he delivered a truckload of feed on credit. Everyone knows what's happening here. Everyone knows what's right. The Peterson Harvest Festival planning provided a welcome distraction from the daily battles. The committee meetings held in Sarah's dining room to avoid potential surveillance at the farmhouse became strategy sessions for both the event and the larger fight to save the farm. "We'll make this the biggest festival yet," Sarah declared. "Show everyone what this farm means to the community." The festival preparations brought unexpected allies. Local businesses donated supplies and prizes. The high school agriculture teacher offered his students help with setup and organization. Even the regional newspaper sent a reporter to cover the planning, resulting in a front-page article about the historic Peterson Farm's uncertain future that cast a decidedly unfavorable light on my uncle's intentions. Martin's reaction to the growing community support was predictable. He called one evening, his lawyer's voice strained with barely controlled anger. "This media circus you're creating is interfering with the orderly administration of the estate," he stated. "The festival needs to be canceled. The property is not available for public events during probate. The festival has been held here for 20 years, I reminded him. Grandpa already made all the arrangements before he died. Canceling now would be disrespectful to his memory and harmful to the community. I'm not asking Jamie. I'm telling you, as executor of the estate, cancel it or I'll be forced to take legal action to protect the property." I ended the call and immediately contacted Elena, who assured me that Martin had no grounds to stop a long-established community event, particularly one that the deceased had specifically planned for before his death. In fact, she suggested his attempt to cancel could work in our favor, demonstrating his disregard for your grandfather's wishes and the farm's role in the community. Document everything, including any attempts to interfere with the festival preparations. 3 days before the hearing on our emergency injunction, I received an unexpected visitor. Uncle David's BMW pulled up the driveway late in the afternoon, but instead of coming to the house, he parked near the old equipment shed and waited. Curious and cautious, I approached his car. David looked terrible. His normally well-groomed appearance disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. "We need to talk," he said, glancing nervously toward the road. "Not here. Can we go somewhere private?" I led him to the workshop in the barn, away from potential listening devices in the house. David paced nervously between the workbenches, running his hands through his thinning hair. "I can't do this anymore," he finally said, his voice cracking. "Martin's gone too far. He's not just bending rules anymore, he's breaking laws, threatening people. I never signed up for this. What exactly did you sign up for, Uncle David? I asked, keeping my voice neutral, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. He collapsed onto a stool, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. It was supposed to be simple. The farm's worth millions, especially with the highway frontage. Martin said Thomas was being sentimental, making poor financial decisions because of his age. We just needed to help him see reason. By destroying his will, David flinched. That wasn't the original plan. We were just going to convince him to modify it, distribute things more evenly. But he was stubborn, kept insisting the farm stay intact, that it go to you. After the fire, Martin saw an opportunity, said if the original will was gone, we could create a more reasonable one. And you went along with it. My real estate business was failing. David admitted not meeting my eyes, medical bills piling up from my son's treatments. Martin offered a way out. My share of the farm would solve everything. I told myself Thomas wouldn't have wanted me to lose everything, that he would have helped if he'd known. His justifications rang hollow, but his distress seemed genuine. Why are you telling me this now? Because Martin's not stopping at the will, he explained, lowering his voice despite our isolation. He's made deals with developers, already signed preliminary agreements before Thomas even died. The buyers are getting impatient. And Martin, he owes them, borrowed against his expected inheritance to cover investment losses. Now they're pressuring him, and he's pressuring me, talking about making problems disappear, including me. I asked, a chill running down my spine. David didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. Just be careful, he warned. Martin has connections you don't know about. People who don't care about legal niceties. I need you to put this on record, I told us. Tell the court what you've just told me. He shook his head violently. I can't. He'd destroy me. My son's medical coverage comes through Martin's firm. My house is mortgaged to the hilt. I've got nothing else. Then why come here at all? I demanded, frustration boiling over. What good does warning me do if you won't help stop him? Because I can't have your blood on my hands, he whispered. I've compromised enough. I draw the line at violence. After David left, I immediately called Elena to relay our conversation. She was troubled but unsurprised by the escalation. This confirms what we suspected about Martin's financial entanglements, she noted. And it explains the rush to liquidate assets. If he's made promises to developers and borrowed against his expected share, he's under tremendous pressure to deliver. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him vulnerable. The hearing for our emergency injunction arrived with tense anticipation. The county courthouse, a stately brick building dating back to the 1890s, had witnessed generations of legal disputes, but few as consequential to the local community as this one. Farmers filled the gallery, their weathered hands and sun-lined faces a stark contrast to the polished appearance of Martin's legal team from Kansas City. Elena had prepared meticulously, organizing our evidence into a compelling narrative that painted a clear picture of my uncle's deception. She began with Grandpa's character and his deep connection to the land, establishing through witness testimony that he was mentally competent and clear about his intentions right up until his death. The authentic will I'd found in the seed drawer became the centerpiece of our case. Document experts testified that the paper, ink, and signatures were all consistent with the date on the document and that it showed no signs of forgery or tampering. They also analyzed the will my uncles had presented, finding several inconsistencies that suggested it had been altered or completely fabricated. Martin's team countered with arguments about my grandfather's supposed mental decline, presenting selective medical records that highlighted memory concerns during routine checkups. They portrayed me as a young opportunist who had forged documents to steal an inheritance that rightfully belonged to Grandpa's sons. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with deep roots in the agricultural community, listened attentively to both sides. She examined the documents carefully, asked pointed questions about the timing of events, and showed particular interest in the mysterious retirement of Harold Brennan. At the conclusion of arguments, she announced her decision without leaving the bench, an unusual move that suggested she'd already formed a strong opinion. The evidence presented by Ms. Peterson raises significant questions about the validity of the will currently being executed, she stated firmly. Until these questions can be fully addressed at trial, I am granting the emergency injunction. No farm assets may be sold, transferred, or removed from the property. The petitioner may continue to reside at the property and maintain normal farm operations with all necessary operating expenses to be released from estate funds. The gallery erupted in approving murmurs, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. This is a temporary measure, only she cautioned. The full case will be scheduled for trial in 3 months' time. I expect both parties to maintain the status quo and refrain from any actions that might prejudice the court's final determination. Outside the courthouse, Elena was cautiously optimistic. First round goes to us, she said as we pushed through reporters from local papers. But Martin won't take this lying down. He'll look for loopholes, try to work around the injunction. Stay vigilant. Martin himself was nowhere to be seen, having left through a side entrance to avoid the press. But his lead attorney caught up with us on the courthouse steps, his expensive suit and slick demeanor, marking him as a big city lawyer unused to small-town scrutiny. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement, he informed us smoothly. Half the farm's assessed value paid immediately. Ms. Peterson could purchase a smaller property nearby, continue farming without the burden of managing such a large operation. Elena didn't miss a beat. My client isn't interested in selling her birthright for a mess of pottage, she replied coolly. But we'd be happy to discuss your client returning to the original terms of Thomas Peterson's actual will. The attorney's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. Your legal gymnastics won't hold up at trial, and trials can be unpredictable, expensive, damaging to family relationships. Mr. Peterson hopes his niece will reconsider what's truly important here. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between us. Elena simply handed him her card and suggested he put any future settlement offers in writing before steering me toward her car. They're worried, she observed as we drove away from the courthouse. That offer tells us they're not as confident as they pretend to be. But it also confirms they're desperate to complete whatever deals Martin has arranged. We need to keep building our case. The injunction buys us time, but the real battle is still ahead. The victory, though temporary, energized the community's support. The Peterson Harvest Festival, now just a week away, became a rallying point. Participation swelled beyond previous years, with families from 3 counties planning to attend. Local businesses donated supplies, prizes, and services. The high school band volunteered to perform. Even the regional agricultural extension office offered educational displays about sustainable farming practices. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I felt hope taking root alongside grief. The farm operations stabilized now that we had access to operating funds again. The late crops promised a good yield despite the earlier sabotage attempts. The livestock thrived under regular care. Even the weather cooperated with clear skies and mild temperatures forecast for the festival weekend. But Martin hadn't surrendered. 2 days after the hearing, I discovered that he had filed appeals on multiple grounds, challenging both the injunction and the judge's impartiality. He claimed that Judge Winters had personal connections to the Peterson farm through her husband's family, creating a conflict of interest she had failed to disclose. Elena dismissed these tactics as desperate, but warned that they could delay proceedings. More concerning were reports from Sarah and other neighbors about unfamiliar vehicles parked along the property boundaries at odd hours. Strange men in business attire were seen walking the perimeter, taking photographs and measurements, consulting documents that appeared to be survey maps. They're planning something, Elena concluded after I reported these sightings. The injunction prevents them from selling farm assets, but there might be loopholes they're exploring. Martin's a clever lawyer, and he's got a team of specialists looking for any advantage. Her prediction proved accurate. The day before the festival, I received notice that Martin had secured a partial modification of the injunction. While the main property remained protected, the judge had allowed the sale of a specific 5-acre parcel along the highway land that had been purchased separately by my grandfather in the 1990s and therefore technically not part of the original family farm. Martin claimed this small sale was necessary to cover estate taxes and legal fees, a reasonable argument that persuaded the court. But Elena immediately recognized the strategic importance of that particular parcel. It's the highway access point, she explained grimly, the only section of the property with direct frontage on the main road. Without it, the rest of the farm is landlocked except for the small county road on the north side. They're trying to control access, perhaps force a situation where the farm becomes less viable or less valuable without that entry point. The news hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa had purchased that parcel specifically to improve access to the main highway, making it easier to move equipment and transport crops to market. Without it, we'd be forced to use the narrow winding country lanes, adding miles and hours to every trip. Can we stop this? I asked Elena desperately. She shook her head. The modification has been granted. The sale can proceed immediately. Our best option now is to try to purchase the parcel ourselves, but I suspect Martin has already arranged a buyer. Indeed, he had. By that evening, a sold sign appeared on the highway frontage identifying the new owner as Midwest Growth Partners, the same development company Martin had been negotiating with before Grandpa's death. The speed of the transaction suggested the deal had been arranged well in advance, just waiting for legal clearance. This was a strategic blow, but we had no time to dwell on it. The Harvest Festival was scheduled to begin the next morning, and final preparations consumed every available hour. Tents rose in the south field, tables and chairs appeared as if by magic. Local restaurants delivered enormous quantities of food, and volunteers transformed the barn into a dance hall with twinkling lights and hay bale seating. By dawn on festival day, the farm hummed with activity. Parking attendants directed early arrivals to designated areas. Food vendors fired up grills and smokers. Musicians tuned instruments on the small stage we'd constructed near the orchard. Children raced between attractions, their laughter a balm to my worried spirit. The turnout exceeded all expectations. By midday, cars lined both sides of the county road for nearly a mile. Families spread blankets under shade trees, sharing potluck dishes and catching up on local news. The high school agriculture students led tours of the working parts of the farm, explaining sustainable practices and heritage farming techniques. Local craft vendors displayed handmade goods that celebrated rural life and agricultural traditions. I moved through the crowds, greeting neighbors and thanking volunteers, all while maintaining a watchful eye for any sign of my uncles. They had no legal grounds to disrupt the festival, but I wouldn't put it past them to try. Mid-afternoon brought an unexpected development. A television news van from the state capitol pulled into the crowded parking area, and a reporter with a cameraman in tow began interviewing festival attendees. Sarah Mitchell found me checking on the livestock displays to report this new wrinkle. Channel 8 News, she explained excitedly. The regional agricultural reporter. Someone contacted them about our situation. The family farm threatened by developers, the community rallying to save it. They're doing a feature story. I hadn't sought media attention, but I couldn't deny its potential value to our cause. The reporter, a young woman with an authentic understanding of rural issues, approached me for an interview. Her questions were thoughtful and balanced, focused on the farm's history, its role in the community, and the broader context of disappearing family farms across the Midwest. This place represents something important that we're losing in America, I told her, gesturing toward the gathered families enjoying the festival. It's not just about growing food. It's about connection to the land, to each other, to something larger than ourselves. When we lose family farms, we lose the knowledge and values they preserve. We lose a way of life that has sustained communities for generations. The story aired on the evening news, reaching households across the state. By the next morning, it had been picked up by national agricultural media outlets and was generating significant social media attention. The Peterson farm became a symbol in the ongoing national conversation about rural America's changing landscape. Martin's response was swift and ruthless. The morning after the festival, a fleet of construction vehicles arrived at the highway parcel. Workers began erecting a chain-link fence along the property line, effectively cutting off the farm's main access point. They placed concrete barriers across the entrance that had served the farm for decades, forcing all traffic to detour miles around to the narrow county road. When I confronted the construction foreman, he simply handed me a notice: private property, no trespassing, no right of access. I immediately called Elena, who confirmed our worst fears. The new owners have absolute rights to control access across their property, she explained. There's no established easement in the property records. Your grandfather never formalized the right-of-way because he owned both parcels. There was no need. Can we challenge this? Create an easement retroactively? We can try, she said, but it's an uphill battle. Martin found a significant vulnerability and exploited it perfectly. This is why he was so focused on getting that specific parcel released from the injunction. The impact on farm operations was immediate and severe. Equipment deliveries had to be rerouted, adding hours and extra costs. Livestock transport became a logistical nightmare. Even basic services like mail delivery were disrupted, with the postal carrier unable to reach the farmhouse through the usual route. More ominously, Martin filed a complaint with the county, alleging that the festival had caused environmental damage to protected wetlands on the property. Though completely fabricated, there were no wetlands anywhere near the festival grounds. The complaint triggered an automatic inspection by county officials who found no violations, but were nevertheless required to file reports and conduct soil tests, creating additional delays and complications. It was psychological warfare designed to wear me down to make the prospect of continuing the fight seem more painful than the surrendering. Each morning brought new challenges: equipment, malfunctions, anonymous complaints to regulatory agencies. Even rumors spread through the community, questioning my ability to manage the farm effectively. Throughout this difficult period, my father remained conspicuously absent. My calls went unanswered, my messages unreturned. Through neighbors, I learned he had moved temporarily to Kansas City, ostensibly for medical treatments, but more likely to avoid the conflict tearing apart his family. His abandonment stung more deeply than I cared to admit. He was choosing the path of least resistance, as he always had, not actively participating in my uncle's schemes, but not standing against them either. I tried to understand his position, caught between brothers and child, between financial dependence and moral obligation, but understanding didn't ease the hurt. One small victory emerged from this challenging time. Martha Harold Brennan's former secretary managed to locate her old boss. He was living under an assumed name in a retirement community in Arkansas, having fled there after Martin's threats. Initially reluctant to get involved, Harold eventually agreed to provide a sworn deposition about the true will and the circumstances surrounding his abrupt retirement. His testimony was damning. He confirmed that Thomas Peterson had been mentally competent until his death, that the will leaving the farm to me was genuine, and that Martin had threatened his law license and personal reputation if he didn't cooperate with the fraudulent will. Martin knew exactly what he was doing, Harold stated in his deposition. He exploited my age and health concerns to force me out. Said he could make allegations of professional misconduct that would strip me of my license and reputation, even if they were eventually disproven. At 73, I couldn't face a lengthy ethics investigation or potential criminal charges, even false ones. Elena considered Harold's testimony a breakthrough. This gives us a first-hand witness to the fraud, she explained. Combined with the documented inconsistencies in the forged will and your grandfather's clear pattern of intentions, we're building an extremely strong case. But the trial was still months away, and Martin seemed determined to render the farm unviable before we could reach that milestone. The fence blocking highway access was just the beginning. Water rights suddenly became an issue when an upstream property owner, coincidentally a business associate of Martin's, began diverting the creek that supplied irrigation water to our southern fields. County inspectors appeared with increasing frequency, citing anonymous complaints about everything from improper pesticide storage to livestock management practices. Though they found no actual violations, each inspection required time and documentation distracting from the essential work of running the farm. Then came the financial pressure. The local bank that had handled the farm's accounts for decades suddenly required additional collateral for existing loans, citing increased risk factors. Equipment leases came up for renewal with dramatically higher rates. Insurance premiums mysteriously doubled, with the agent apologetically explaining that the farm had been recategorized into a higher risk pool. Behind each of these obstacles, I could sense Martin's influence, his connections, his legal expertise, his understanding of how to apply pressure through seemingly unrelated channels. He was creating a web of difficulties designed to exhaust my resources and resolve before we ever reached the courtroom. The community continued to rally around us, finding creative ways to overcome each new challenge. Neighboring farmers helped with water management when the creek diversion threatened our crops. Local mechanics kept equipment running when parts became mysteriously unavailable through regular suppliers. The County Agricultural Extension Office provided documentation refuting unfounded environmental complaints. But even with this support, the constant battles were taking their toll. I was sleeping only a few hours each night, dividing my time between farm operations, legal preparations, and crisis management. The strain showed in my face, in the weight I'd lost, in the tremor that sometimes affected my hands after too many days with too little rest. Elena noticed my exhaustion during one of our case preparation meetings. "You need to pace yourself," she warned. "Martin is trying to wear you down before trial. Don't let him succeed." I know, I admitted, but someone has to keep this place running. The livestock can't feed themselves. The crops won't harvest themselves. Have you considered bringing in help, she suggested. Not the management company Martin proposed, but people you trust. There's no shame in admitting you can't do everything alone. Her words struck a chord. Grandpa had always emphasized self-reliance, but he'd also understood the value of community. He regularly exchanged labor with neighboring farms during busy seasons, participating in a tradition of mutual support that had sustained rural communities for generations. The next day, I called a meeting of local farmers who had shown support for our cause. In Sarah Mitchell's dining room over coffee and homemade pie, I explained our situation and asked for their help. I can't fight this battle and run the farm alone, I admitted, not against someone with Martin's resources and connections. I need your help, not just moral support, but practical assistance, labor, equipment, expertise. I can't pay much right now, but I can promise fair compensation once the legal issues are resolved. Pete Murphy spoke first, his weathered face serious beneath his feed store cap. Thomas Peterson helped me save my farm during the drought of '03. Wouldn't take a dime for his time or equipment. Said that's what neighbors do. Reckon it's time to return the favor. One by one, the others voiced similar sentiments. Bill Jackson offered to handle livestock management 2 days a week. The Andersons volunteered their son and his friends from the high school agriculture program to help with daily chores. Sarah Mitchell, despite her age, insisted she could manage record keeping and supply ordering. By the end of the evening, we had created a rotation schedule that would keep the farm running without exhausting any single person. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would get us through until the trial. As the meeting concluded, Sarah pulled me aside, her expression troubled. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Rumors around town say Martin's been meeting with county commissioners about rezoning the northern section of the farm from agricultural to commercial use. If he succeeds, that land becomes much more valuable to developers regardless of who ultimately owns it." The news sent a chill through me. Rezoning would fundamentally change the character and potential of the property, opening the door to strip malls and parking lots where crops had grown for generations. Even if we won the case, we might inherit a farm that could no longer function as one. Elena added this new threat to our growing list of concerns. "Rezoning requires public hearings," she noted. "We'll need to mobilize community opposition, present evidence of the agricultural value of the land, and highlight the potential negative impacts of commercial development." The rezoning issue became yet another battlefront in our increasingly complex war. I researched county regulations, gathered soil quality data, demonstrating the land's agricultural value, and prepared testimony for the upcoming hearing. Meanwhile, Martin's experts compiled traffic studies, economic impact projections, and glossy renderings of proposed developments that promise jobs and tax revenue. The evening before the rezoning hearing, Uncle David appeared at the farmhouse again, looking even more haggard than during his previous visit. "Martin knows you found the real will," he said, without preamble. "Someone told him about the seed drawer." The revelation stunned me. I'd been so careful, had told only Elena, Sarah, and Martha about the specific location. Someone had leaked information from our inner circle. David continued, his words tumbling out rapidly. "He's desperate now. The developers are threatening to call in his loans if he doesn't deliver the property soon. He's leveraged everything: his house, his law practice, his reputation. If this deal falls through, he loses everything." "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, still processing the breach of security. "Because I'm afraid of what he might do next," David replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's talking to people. People who solve problems outside the legal system. I had to warn you." Before I could press for details, David's phone buzzed. He checked it, his face paling. "I have to go. He's looking for me. Just be careful. Very careful." He hurried back to his car and sped away, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. I immediately called Elena, who took the warning seriously. "We need to increase security at the farm," she advised. "Document everything, install cameras if possible, make sure you're never alone. And we need to secure all our evidence in multiple locations. If Martin is getting desperate enough to consider extra-legal methods, we can't take any chances." That night, with the help of Sarah's son, who worked in IT, we installed security cameras covering the house and main barns. I moved the original will from its hiding place under the oak tree to a safe deposit box in a bank 2 counties away, accessible only by Elena in case something happened to me. The rezoning hearing the next morning became a community showdown. The county meeting room overflowed with farmers, many wearing Save Family Farms buttons created for the occasion. Martin arrived with a team of experts and consultants, their briefcases bulging with professional reports and economic projections. The commissioners listened politely to both sides. Martin's team presented slick visualizations of a rural commerce center that would bring economic opportunity while preserving agricultural heritage. They promised jobs, tax revenue, and infrastructure improvements, all while minimizing environmental impacts. Our presentation was less polished but more authentic. Local farmers spoke about the importance of preserving prime farmland, the irreversible nature of development, and the cultural significance of maintaining working farms. I presented soil quality data and historical yield information demonstrating the land's agricultural value. The most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. The high school agriculture teacher brought student projects showing the educational value of access to working farms. A local historian presented photographs documenting 4 generations of Petersons working the land, highlighting its role in the county's development. Even the pastor spoke about the spiritual importance of maintaining the connections to the land that sustain the community. At the conclusion of testimony, the commissioners announced they would defer their decision, needing time to consider all the evidence presented. It wasn't the clear victory we'd hoped for, but neither was it the rubber stamp Martin had expected. As we left the meeting, a county clerk I'd known since childhood slipped me a note. Check property records for recent easements. Today, if possible. Elena and I went directly to the county recorder's office, where we discovered that Martin had filed an easement document just that morning, claiming to establish a utility corridor through the heart of the farm. The document, bearing what appeared to be my grandfather's signature, granted perpetual rights to install water, sewer, and power lines across the property, essential infrastructure for future development. The signature date was 3 years ago, but I knew it was forged. Grandpa would never have agreed to such an arrangement, and I'd seen no mention of it in any of his records. Elena immediately filed an emergency motion challenging the easement's authenticity, but the damage was done. The existence of the document, however fraudulent, would complicate any future use of the property until it could be legally invalidated, a process that could take months or years. Martin is laying the groundwork for development, regardless of the will contest outcome, Elena explained as we left the courthouse. Even if we win, he's creating encumbrances that will either force you to sell or significantly reduce the farm's agricultural viability. The pattern became clear. Martin wasn't just fighting for ownership. He was systematically undermining the farm's value and function as an agricultural property. The blocked highway access, the water diversion, the proposed rezoning, and now the fabricated utility easement, each move designed to transform the land from a working farm into a development opportunity. 2 days later, disaster struck. I awoke to the sound of sirens in the pre-dawn darkness. Racing outside, I saw flames engulfing the main barn, the same barn that contained the workshop where Grandpa had hidden his will, where David and I had met, where much of the essential equipment was stored. Fire trucks from 3 townships responded, but the blaze had too much of a head start. By sunrise, only charred timbers and twisted metal remained of the structure that had stood for over 60 years. The fire marshal arrived to investigate, carefully picking through the smoldering ruins. No definitive cause was determined, but the marshal noted several troubling factors. The fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously. An empty gasoline container was found behind the building. The security cameras I'd installed had been disabled shortly before the first flames appeared. While the evidence strongly suggested arson, there was nothing directly linking Martin to the fire. When questioned by investigators, he expressed appropriate shock and concern, suggesting that faulty wiring or improperly stored chemicals might be responsible. His whereabouts during the critical hours were verified by multiple witnesses at a charity function in Kansas City. The barn fire marked a turning point in our struggle. The physical destruction was devastating enough. Irreplaceable equipment, lost historical items reduced to ash, the heart of the farm's operations destroyed. But the psychological impact cut even deeper. This wasn't just legal maneuvering or financial pressure. This was violence against the farm itself, a violation that felt intensely personal. For the first time since discovering the hidden will, I questioned whether I could win this fight. Martin had resources, connections, and an apparent willingness to go to extremes I couldn't match. Each day brought new obstacles, new attacks from unexpected directions. How long could I hold out against such relentless pressure? Elena sensed my wavering resolve when we met to discuss the fire investigation. Don't give him what he wants, she urged. This escalation means we're winning. He wouldn't resort to such desperate measures if his legal position was strong. But at what cost, I asked, gesturing toward the blackened ruins of the barn. How much destruction am I willing to accept? How much risk to myself and others who support me? That's a decision only you can make, she acknowledged. But remember what you're fighting for. This isn't just about ownership of property. It's about your grandfather's legacy, about the future of farming in this community, about standing up to someone who believes money and power should trump truth and justice. Her words resonated, reminding me of the larger principles at stake. This wasn't just my battle. It belonged to everyone who believed that family farms mattered, that communities should determine their own futures, that might doesn't make right. That evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the fields in golden light, Sarah Mitchell arrived with her border collie in a casserole dish. She settled into the rocking chair beside me, her presence comforting without requiring conversation. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Your grandfather faced setbacks too, you know. The drought of '88 that nearly bankrupted him. The tornado of '95 that destroyed half his equipment. The agricultural crisis of the early 2000s that forced so many others to sell. He rebuilt every time. Adapted. Found a way forward. I know, I replied, watching the last light fade from the western sky. But he wasn't fighting his own family. Sarah's weathered hand covered mine briefly. Family is more than blood, Jamie. Look around you. All these people helping, supporting, standing with you, that's family too. The kind you choose. The kind that chooses you. As darkness settled over the farm, I made my decision. I would continue the fight, not just for myself or even for Grandpa, but for everyone who believed that some things were worth preserving, some principles worth defending, some battles worth the cost of engagement. The next morning, I called a community meeting at the local church. Nearly 100 people attended, filling the basement meeting room to capacity. I explained the situation frankly, the escalating tactics, the fire, the long road still ahead before trial. I can't promise we'll win, I told them honestly. Martin has money connections and apparently no ethical boundaries. But I can promise I won't give up as long as this farm has a chance, as long as you're with me. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Farmers offered equipment to replace what had been lost in the fire. Construction workers volunteered to help rebuild the barn. Retired teachers proposed educational programs that would document the farm's historical and cultural significance, creating a record that might influence future legal decisions. Most surprisingly, a local business association represented by the hardware store owner pledged financial support for our legal expenses, explaining that they understood the economic importance of maintaining working farms in the region. This is bigger than one family or one property, the hardware store owner explained. This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place that preserves its agricultural heritage and supports family farms? Or do we want to be just another exit off the highway with the same chain stores and fast food restaurants as everywhere else? The meeting transformed into a strategy session with committees forming to address specific challenges, rebuilding legal support, community education, media relations. People who had been passive supporters became active participants, contributing their skills and resources to the cause. As the meeting concluded, Pete Murphy approached with news that sent a ripple of excitement through the room. Harold Brennan is coming back, he announced. Got a call from his wife this morning. Says he's tired of hiding, wants to set things right. He'll be here next week to meet with your lawyer. The return of Grandpa's longtime attorney represented a potential turning point in our case. His direct testimony about the authentic will and Martin's threats would be far more powerful than his deposition alone. More importantly, his willingness to face Martin, after months in hiding, demonstrated that the tide might be turning, that truth could still prevail against intimidation. The next day, I received an unexpected call from the State Attorney General's office. An investigator explained that they had received information about potential fraud and witness intimidation related to our case and were opening a preliminary inquiry. They requested copies of our documentation and arranged interviews with key witnesses, including Harold Brennan, upon his return. The involvement of state authorities added a new dimension to our struggle. Martin had significant influence in the county, but the state level represented a broader jurisdiction where his connections might hold less sway. If criminal charges resulted from the investigation, the entire dynamic of our case would change. Elena was cautiously optimistic about this development. The civil case is about the will and property ownership, she explained, but fraud, forgery, witness, intimidation, those are criminal matters. If the Attorney General's office finds sufficient evidence, Martin could face charges regardless of the outcome of our will contest. For the first time in months, momentum seemed to be shifting in our favor. The community had rallied more strongly than ever after the barn fire. Harold Brennan was returning to testify. State authorities were investigating potential criminal aspects of Martin's actions. Even the county commissioners had delayed their rezoning decision, suggesting they weren't simply rubber stamping development plans. But Martin had one more devastating move to play. Late that afternoon, I received an urgent call from Sarah Mitchell. Jamie, she said, her voice tight with concern. There's a construction crew at the North Field. They're digging trenches right through the winter wheat. I drove there immediately to find heavy equipment cutting deep channels across the productive field, destroying the nearly mature crop. The foreman presented permits for utility installations, citing the easement Martin had filed with its questionable signature from my grandfather. Once a utility easement is filed, they can begin work immediately, Elena confirmed when I called her from the field. We've challenged its authenticity, but until a judge specifically invalidates it, they have legal right of access. The best I can do is file for another emergency hearing, but that will take at least 48 hours. By then, the damage would be extensive, not just to this year's crop, but to the soil structure built over decades of careful management. The deep trenches would alter drainage patterns, potentially affecting multiple fields. The heavy equipment was compacting soil that had been meticulously maintained for optimal tilth. This was no mere inconvenience or temporary setback. This was permanent damage to the farm's productive capacity, a wound that would take years to heal even under the best circumstances. And it was happening with full legal authorization protected by permits and easements that, however fraudulently obtained, carried the force of law. I stood at the edge of the ruined field as the sun set behind me, watching the machines tear through generations of careful stewardship. This was Martin's message. Even if I eventually won legal ownership, I would inherit a diminished, damaged property. He would destroy what he couldn't possess. The physical attack on the land itself, more than any legal maneuver or financial pressure, revealed the true nature of the conflict. This wasn't just about money or property rights. This was about fundamentally different values between those who saw land as a commodity to be exploited and those who understood it as a living trust to be nurtured and preserved. As darkness fell over the devastated field, I made another call, not to Elena or the community supporters, but to Uncle David. For the first time since this began, I was the one seeking him out rather than the other way around. "Tell Martin I want to talk," I said when he answered. "Not through lawyers, face to face. Tomorrow morning at the farmhouse." David hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise? After everything that's happened?" "I'm sure nothing worse can happen by talking," I replied, watching another section of wheat fall beneath the excavator's blade. "Tell him I have a proposal he'll want to hear." After hanging up, I sat in my truck for a long time watching the construction lights illuminate the steady destruction of Grandpa's careful work. The decision I was contemplating felt like both surrender and strategy, defeat and defiance. There would be no perfect victory here, no clean resolution that restored everything to what it had been. But perhaps there was a path forward that honored what mattered most, not just ownership, but stewardship. Not just winning, but preserving what was truly worth saving. Whatever happened next would change the farm and me forever. The question was whether that change would destroy what made this place special or transform it into something that could survive in a changing world while maintaining its essential character. As I finally drove back to the farmhouse, I passed the oak tree where I'd temporarily buried the will, where Grandpa and I had sat countless times watching the seasons change across the fields. "They see dollar signs where we see home," he had written. Now I needed to find a way to protect that home, even if it meant giving up some of what I'd been fighting for. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, negotiation, and difficult choices. But tonight I allowed myself one last evening to remember the farm as it had been, to honor what had been lost, and to prepare for whatever compromise future might be possible. The morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect Missouri autumn day that belied the tension awaiting in the farmhouse kitchen. I'd been up since before sunrise, walking the property one final time before the meeting that might determine its fate. The scarred field where utility trenches now cut through winter wheat, the blackened remains of the barn, the fence blocking our highway access. Each wound to the land strengthened my resolve while clarifying the impossible situation we faced. Uncle Martin arrived precisely at 9, driving his Mercedes with typical precision. Uncle David followed minutes later, parking his BMW at a cautious distance as if anticipating a quick retreat. I watched them through the kitchen window, noting how Martin strode confidently toward the house while David followed with hunched shoulders and darting eyes. I'd prepared coffee, placing it on the table alongside Grandma's old china cups, a deliberate choice meant to evoke family history. Martin entered without knocking, his expensive suit incongruous against the worn farmhouse kitchen. David lingered in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," I began, pouring coffee with deliberate calm. "I think we all want to end this situation." Martin's smile never reached his eyes. "Indeed. Your attorney mentioned you might be reconsidering our settlement offer. Half the appraised value is extremely generous given the circumstances." "Actually, I have a different proposal." I set my cup down carefully. "You get the highway frontage in the north field, the areas with development potential. I retain the original homestead, the south fields, and the pasture land. We split the remaining acreage. The family name remains on the property through me, while you get the financial return you need." Martin's expression hardened. "That arrangement significantly undervalues the developable portions." "The highway frontage alone is already sold," I interrupted. "I know about Midwest Growth Partners. I know about your financial obligations. The question isn't whether development happens, it's whether it happens with scorched earth or with some preservation of the farm's legacy." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across Martin's face. He glanced at David, who was studying the floor with intense fascination. "What exactly are you proposing?" Martin asked, his lawyer's caution evident. "A structured settlement. You get immediate zoning changes and development rights for the highway corridor and Northfield, approximately 30% of the total acreage. I retain the historic homestead and southern agricultural lands. The remaining acreage becomes a buffer zone with conservation easements, preventing future development while allowing sustainable agriculture. Both sides publicly support this compromise. That land is worth millions with proper development." Martin countered, though his tone lacked its usual certainty. "And worthless if tied up in litigation for years with potential criminal investigations into fraud and witness intimidation," I replied. "The state attorney general's office is already investigating. Harold Brennan returns tomorrow to testify." David's head snapped up at this news. The mention of criminal charges clearly struck a nerve. Martin maintained his composure, but I noticed his knuckles whitening around his coffee cup. "Even if you eventually win the case," I continued, "how much will be left of the farm by then? How much more damage are you willing to do? How much legal exposure are you willing to risk?" The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of Grandpa's old wall clock. Through the window, I could see Sarah Mitchell walking her border collie along our shared property line, keeping a watchful eye on the meeting from a discreet distance. "We would need assurances that you'd support the necessary zoning changes," Martin finally said. "No further legal challenges or community opposition. And I would need ironclad legal protections for the portions I retain," I countered, "plus restoration of damaged fields and removal of the access barriers, and a public acknowledgement that Grandpa intended the farm to continue operations under my management." Martin's expression remained unreadable, but I sensed calculations happening behind his eyes. Financial obligations versus legal risks, immediate gains versus potential losses. David broke the silence unexpectedly. "It could work, Martin. We get what we need financially. Jamie keeps the historical parts running as a farm. The family legacy continues in both ways." Martin shot him a warning glance, but David continued it with unusual determination. "Thomas would have approved of this compromise. You know he would. Everyone gets something they value." I let their exchange hang in the air, neither pushing nor retreating. This wasn't surrender. It was strategic preservation of what mattered most. The agricultural heart of the farm would survive, continuing the work that had defined generations of Petersons. The legacy wouldn't be intact, but it would endure. "I'll have my attorneys draft a proposed settlement," Martin finally said, rising from the table. "No guarantees until I see the numbers work." I stood as well, meeting his gaze directly. "One more condition. The document must acknowledge the existence of Grandpa's original will and its intentions. I need that truth recognized, even if we're creating a new arrangement." Martin's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod before turning toward the door. David lingered behind, waiting until his brother was out of earshot. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Fighting would have destroyed everything, not just parts. This way, something meaningful survives." I wasn't seeking his approval or absolution, but his words confirmed my own assessment. This compromise wasn't perfect. The farm would be forever changed, diminished in acreage, but preserved in purpose. The alternative was continued destruction until nothing remained worth saving. After they left, I called Elena to explain the proposed settlement. She was cautiously supportive, but insisted on handling all legal aspects of the negotiation. "It's a practical compromise," she acknowledged. "But we negotiate from strength, not desperation." Martin needs this deal more than he's admitting. With Harold Brennan returning and the Attorney General investigating his position, weakens daily. The next week brought intense negotiations. Elena proved masterful, leveraging Martin's legal vulnerabilities and time pressure to strengthen our position. The settlement expanded beyond my initial proposal, securing additional protections for the agricultural portions of the property and establishing a conservation easement that would permanently prevent development on the buffer zone between commercial and agricultural areas. Most importantly, the agreement included a formal acknowledgement that Thomas Peterson's original intention had been for me to inherit and manage the farm as an agricultural property. This wasn't just a symbolic victory, it was the truth I had been fighting for all along. 3 days into negotiations, Uncle David suffered a mild heart attack, likely triggered by the stress of the situation. From his hospital bed, he made a decision that changed the dynamic entirely. He signed a sworn affidavit confirming the destruction of the original Will Martin's role in creating the fraudulent replacement and the pressure tactics used against Harold Brennan. "We burned it in the fireplace," his statement read. Martin said it was the only way to make sure the farm wouldn't be wasted on agriculture when it could be developed. He said Jamie would understand eventually that we were doing the right thing for everyone. This bombshell strengthened our negotiating position considerably. With David's confession and Harold Brennan's corroborating testimony, Martin faced not just civil liability, but potential criminal charges. His initial reluctance transformed into urgency to finalize the settlement, which now included immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure and restitution. The community's reaction to the compromise was mixed. Some saw it as a necessary resolution that preserved the most important aspects of the farm while ending a destructive conflict. Others viewed any development as a betrayal of agricultural heritage. I understood both perspectives, but remained convinced we had found the best possible outcome from an impossible situation. The Peterson Harvest Festival, despite having just passed, became the venue for announcing the settlement publicly. We organized a special community meeting in the orchard where the fall apples hung heavy on branches Grandpa had pruned last winter. Nearly 200 people gathered to hear the terms directly from me rather than through rumor and speculation. Standing on the flatbed trailer we'd use as a stage during the festival, I explained the compromise in straightforward terms: what would be preserved, what would change, how the agricultural operations would continue alongside limited development. "This isn't the outcome I initially fought for," I acknowledged to the assembled crowd, "but it ensures that the heart of the Peterson farm will continue for generations, that the knowledge and traditions my grandfather valued will endure, that this land will continue producing food rather than just profit." Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of the crowd, her weathered face reflecting the complexity. Many felt a relief that the battle was ending, sadness at the partial loss, hope for what might still be preserved. The settlement became official 2 weeks later, signed in the county courthouse under the watchful eye of Judge Winters. Martin, David, my father, and I sat at the same table for the first time since Grandpa's funeral, each signing our names to documents that redefined our family's relationship with the land and with each other. My father had returned from Kansas City for the signing, looking older and more fragile than when he'd left. His signature trembled slightly on the page, his eyes not meeting mine, as he officially relinquished claims to the portions of the farm allocated to me. We hadn't spoken privately yet, the gulf between us still too wide for casual conversation. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for statements. Martin delivered a carefully crafted message about honoring family legacy while embracing progress, before departing quickly in his Mercedes. I spoke more plainly about the importance of preserving agricultural land and the challenges facing family farms across America. My father slipped away without comment, head bowed, shoulders hunched against questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer. The following months brought rapid change to parts of the property, while others remained steadfastly the same. Construction began along the highway frontage, earth-moving equipment, reshaping land that had grown crops for generations. I couldn't bear to watch this transformation, focusing instead on rebuilding what had been damaged and strengthening what remained. The community's support shifted from legal and political assistance to practical help with farm operations. Volunteers gathered for a traditional barn raising to replace the structure destroyed by fire. Local craftsmen contributed skills passed down through generations alongside modern construction techniques from younger builders. The resulting barn honored traditional design while incorporating improvements for efficiency and safety. The reconstruction of the barn became symbolic of our larger compromise, preserving the essential function and appearance while adapting to new realities. Old timber, salvaged from the fire-damaged structure, formed the central beams, while modern materials completed the framework. The blend of old and new created something neither purely traditional nor entirely contemporary, but uniquely suited to the farm's current circumstances. Bill Jackson, who'd shared equipment with Grandpa for 30 years, organized the barn raising, calling in favors from throughout the farming community. Veterans of many such events worked alongside younger participants experiencing their first community building project. Knowledge transferred naturally between generations: proper angles for roof pitch, techniques for raising heavy beams, traditional joinery methods that had proven their worth over centuries. "This is how we've always done things that matter," Bill explained to a group of high school students helping with the roof trusses. Not just one family struggling alone, but everyone pitching in. Your grandfather understood that better than most, always first to help when someone else's barn needed work. By midwinter, the new barn stood complete, its red paint bright against the snow-covered fields. Inside the workshop had been carefully recreated, with Grandpa's tool collection returned to its proper place. The seed drawers, including the corn seed drawer that had revealed the hidden will, occupied their original position along the far wall. The physical heart of the farm had been restored even as its boundaries had been redrawn. Winter brought a quiet period to reflect and plan. With the legal battles resolved, I could finally focus on the farm's future rather than just its preservation. Grandpa's careful records provided guidance, but I also implemented sustainable practices learned during my agricultural studies: cover cropping, rotational grazing, water conservation systems that would make the reduced acreage more productive while improving soil health. Sarah Mitchell became an invaluable advisor, her decades of farming experience complementing my academic knowledge. We often sat at her kitchen table mapping crop rotations and livestock management plans, while her border collie dozed at our feet. Her practical wisdom grounded my theoretical approaches, creating balanced strategies that honored tradition while embracing innovation. "You're not just preserving the past," she observed one evening as we reviewed seed catalogs for spring planting. "You're building something new that still carries the important parts forward." That's what Thomas would have wanted. The Peterson Farm Protection Trust, which Grandpa had established to fund our legal defense, now shifted to supporting educational initiatives. We established an internship program for agricultural students, providing hands-on experience in sustainable farming practices. The old bunkhouse, once used for seasonal workers, was renovated into simple housing for interns and visiting researchers. Throughout these changes, my father remained a distant figure. He had moved back to town but rarely visited the farm, seemingly uncomfortable with both the development occurring on some portions and the agricultural revival happening on others. His absence was a persistent ache beneath the daily work of rebuilding. One January evening, as I struggled to repair an aging tractor in the new barn, headlights swept across the gravel drive. My father emerged from his truck, stomping snow from his boots before entering the workshop. Without preamble, he picked up a wrench and positioned himself on the opposite side of the engine. "Try the fuel injector," he suggested after studying the problem. Thomas had trouble with this model back in '05. Same symptoms. We worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour, the shared task bridging some small part of the distance between us. When the engine finally sputtered to life, he allowed himself a brief smile, the first I'd seen since before Grandpa's death. Your grandfather taught you well, he observed, wiping grease from his hands. But he didn't know everything about modern equipment. Might be time to consider updating some of these older pieces. The practical suggestion, delivered without criticism, acknowledged both respect for tradition and the necessity of adaptation. It was the closest he had come to engaging with the farm's future rather than mourning its divided past. By early spring, the first signs of commercial development had manifested along the highway foundation, work for what would eventually become a rural marketplace, featuring local products alongside modern amenities. Martin's development company had made concessions in the design, using architectural elements that echoed traditional farm structures rather than imposing generic commercial buildings on the landscape. The contrast between the construction zone and the agricultural sections of the property was stark, but not as jarring as I had feared. The conservation buffer, with its restored prairie grasses and wetland areas, created a natural transition between the two worlds. This middle ground, neither fully developed nor traditionally farmed, became unexpectedly valuable, a habitat for wildlife displaced by regional development. Pete Murphy from the feed store observed this transformation during one of his regular deliveries. Never thought I'd see it, he admitted, watching a great blue heron wading in a newly created wetland area. But there's something right about it, using each piece of land for what it's best suited for, not trying to make it all the same. His observation captured something essential about our compromise. Different portions of the property now serve different functions. Commercial development, where access made retail viable; conservation, where fragile ecosystems needed protection; agriculture, where soil and topography favored food production. The integration wasn't perfect, but it reflected a more nuanced understanding of land use than either pure preservation or total development would have achieved. One mild April morning, as I inspected the emerging winter wheat in the south field, I spotted a familiar truck coming up the county road. My father parked at the field's edge and walked slowly toward me, his gait uncertain on the uneven ground. He looked out of place in his town clothes, a visitor to the world he had once inhabited. We stood in awkward silence before he finally spoke. The wheat looks good. Strong stand. His farmer's assessment, delivered in the laconic style of rural men who measure words, carefully bridged some small part of the distance between us. Grandpa's heritage variety, I replied. More disease-resistant than the commercial strains. He nodded, eyes scanning the field with professional appreciation, despite his years away from active farming. We walked the field's perimeter together, discussing soil conditions and rainfall patterns with the technical vocabulary that had been our first shared language. As we neared the farmhouse, he paused, looking toward the distant construction at the highway edge, then back to the historic buildings at the property's heart. You found a way to save what matters most, he finally said. I didn't think that was possible. The simple acknowledgement carried the weight of apology, explanation, and admiration all at once. It wasn't forgiveness that would require more direct conversations about his role in what had happened, but it was a beginning, a small thread reconnecting severed family bonds. I should have stood with you from the start, he added, studying the weathered boards of the machine shed rather than meeting my eyes. Was too afraid of losing what little security I had. Too used to letting Martin make the decisions. The admission surprised me with its candor. My father had always hidden vulnerability behind silence, retreating rather than confronting difficult truths. You're here now, I replied, neither absolving nor condemning. The farm still needs experienced hands. He glanced at me sharply, assessing whether the offer was genuine. I'll come by tomorrow, he said finally. Help with the spring maintenance on the equipment. It was a tentative step toward reconciliation, framed in the practical terms that felt safest for both of us. The deeper conversations would come eventually, but for now, working side by side would begin rebuilding what had been broken. As we approached the farmhouse, I noticed Sarah Mitchell's car parked in the driveway. She sat on the porch with Harold Brennan, who had returned permanently to the community after Martin's legal threats had been neutralized by the settlement. Thomas would be proud, Harold said as we joined them on the porch. Not just of saving part of the farm, but of finding a solution when total victory wasn't possible. He was always practical that way. The four of us sat in comfortable silence, watching the interplay of sunlight and shadow across the fields. Each represented a different generation, a different relationship with the land, yet all were bound by commitment to its preservation in whatever form proved possible. "May I see it?" Harold asked unexpectedly. The seed drawer where Thomas hid the will. I led them down to the basement workshop where the wooden drawer still stood against the far wall. The corn seed drawer had been repaired after my discovery, continuing its practical function while now carrying historical significance as well. "Thomas always did like hiding things in plain sight," Harold remarked, running his hand along the drawer's edge. "His most valuable possession protected by something most people would overlook entirely." "Seeds and documents," Sarah observed. "Both contain futures waiting to unfold. Both need proper care to fulfill their potential." Her comparison captured something essential about what we had preserved. The farm wasn't just land and buildings, it was a repository of knowledge, traditions, and possibilities. Like the carefully selected seeds Grandpa had saved each season, his legacy would continue growing in new forms adapted to changing conditions. As spring advanced into summer, the divided property settled into its new rhythms. My father became a more regular presence, initially focusing on equipment maintenance, but gradually expanding his involvement to the crop planting and livestock management. Our conversations remained mostly practical, centered on the work at hand, but occasional personal moments broke through the professional facade. "I should have told you what Martin was planning," he admitted one evening as we repaired fencing along the conservation buffer, "but I didn't want to believe it myself. Easier to go along, pretend it was all for the best." We each carried our share of regret, I acknowledged. "I was so focused on fighting for the whole farm that I nearly lost everything. Sometimes partial victories are all we get." The honest exchange marked another small step toward healing the family breach. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding, recognition that we had all been caught in currents larger than ourselves, making imperfect choices with limited information and constrained options. Uncle David's recovery from his heart attack progressed slowly but steadily. By early summer, he had begun making regular visits to the farm, often bringing his teenage son, who showed unexpected interest in agricultural operations. David himself seemed changed by his health crisis, in subsequent confession, more reflective and less driven by financial concerns. "I wanted to show Michael what his grandfather valued." David explained during one visit, watching his son help with a calf delivery. "City life has advantages, but there are things you can only learn from working closely with the land and animals." The perspective shift represented another aspect of our complex compromise, not just dividing physical property, but reconnecting family members with values and experiences they had abandoned in pursuit of other priorities. David would never become a farmer, but he had rediscovered appreciation for the lifestyle he had once dismissed. Uncle Martin remained the most distant, maintaining strictly professional contact through the development process. Occasionally, I would spot his Mercedes parked at the construction site, his tailored suits incongruous among the bulldozers and cement mixers. He acknowledged me with curt nods when our paths crossed, but avoided substantive conversation. The one exception came during a county agricultural committee meeting, where both of us had been invited to discuss the integration of commercial and farming operations. After the formal proceedings, he approached me in the parking lot. "The arrangement is working better than I anticipated," he conceded, studying the horizon rather than meeting my eyes. "The development is proceeding on schedule, and I understand your yields are above regional averages, despite the reduced acreage." It was as close to approval as Martin could offer a businessman's assessment of measurable outcomes rather than an emotional reconciliation. I accepted it in the spirit offered, acknowledging that some relationships could be functional without becoming warm. "Your marketing consultant approached me about featuring farm products in the marketplace shops," I replied. "Seems like a natural integration." He nodded, business calculation replacing momentary personal connection. "Local sourcing creates marketing advantages. We should discuss specific arrangements." The conversation represented our new reality. Not family harmony restored, but pragmatic cooperation between entities with different priorities, but overlapping interests. It wasn't the relationship Grandpa would have wanted for his sons and grandchild, but it was functional in a way complete estrangement would not have been. Summer brought the first harvest from the restored fields, yields exceeding expectations despite the reduced acreage. Modern techniques combined with Grandpa's meticulous soil management created productivity that surprised even experienced neighboring farmers. The Agricultural Extension Office documented our methods for demonstration to other family farms facing similar pressures to downsize. The Peterson Harvest Festival that autumn was reimagined as an educational event alongside its traditional celebration. Workshops on sustainable agriculture ran throughout the day. Local food producers showcased products made from farm ingredients. The high school agriculture program demonstrated techniques they were learning through our internship partnership. Most significantly, the festival now occupied both worlds of the divided property. The rural marketplace, nearing completion on the developed section, hosted artisans and value-added products, while the agricultural portions featured crop demonstrations and livestock exhibits. The conservation buffer between hosted nature walks and wildlife education. The arrangement wasn't what any of us had initially wanted, but it had evolved into something that perhaps served the community better than either extreme would have. The commercial development provided economic opportunities previously unavailable in our rural area. The preserved agricultural land maintained food production and farming knowledge. The conservation areas protected ecological services increasingly recognized as valuable. Uncle Martin attended the festival, briefly maintaining a professional distance, but acknowledging the success of the compromise with a curt nod during our brief encounter. Uncle David, still recovering from his heart attack and subsequent bypass surgery, spent more time at the agricultural exhibits, genuinely interested in the heritage varieties we were preserving and the sustainable methods being implemented. The most meaningful interaction came late in the day as sunset painted the fields in golden light. My father and I stood at the crest of the hill overlooking the property, the same spot where I had made my silent promise to fight for the farm nearly a year earlier. "Your grandfather stood here with me when I was about your age," he said, breaking our companionable silence. "Told me the land would outlast all of us if we treated it right. Said our job wasn't to own it, but to care for it while we're here." "I've been thinking about that a lot," I replied. "We don't really own land, we just borrow it from future generations. Our names might be on the deeds, but the soil and water and living things have their own existence beyond our legal fictions." He nodded, the wisdom resonating with his own reconnection to the property. I spent too many years thinking about the farm as something to escape from then, something to profit from. Never really understood what Thomas saw in it until I nearly lost it completely. As darkness settled over the fields, lights came on in the farmhouse below. The same warm glow that had welcomed generations of Petersons home from their labors. The festival crowds had departed, leaving the land to its permanent residents and caretakers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight offered a moment to appreciate what had been saved, what had been created from conflict and compromise. 6 months after the settlement, I received an unexpected package from Harold Brennan. Inside was a journal, not Grandpa's farm records, but a personal diary I hadn't known existed. A note from Harold explained that Grandpa had left it in his safekeeping with instructions to deliver it to me when the dust settles. The journal spanned decades, recording not crop yields or livestock lineages, but personal reflections on the meaning of the work, the connection to the land, the hopes for future generations. The final entry, dated just weeks before his death, addressed me directly. "Jamie, by the time you read this, the battle I've been preparing for will have come and gone. I don't know exactly how it played out, but I trust you found the strength to fight for what matters. Maybe you saved it all, maybe just parts. What's important isn't the acreage or the buildings, but the understanding of what this place represents, a different way of relating to the land and to each other. As long as that understanding continues, the farm lives on whatever its physical boundaries." Reading his words brought both tears and clarity. The compromise hadn't been a failure, but a fulfillment of what Grandpa valued most, the continuation of the farm's essential character, adapted to new realities rather than destroyed by rigid adherence to an impossible ideal. The journal became a guide as I navigated the farm's new identity. Grandpa's reflections on drought years showed resilience in the face of setbacks. His notes about integrating new techniques with traditional knowledge demonstrated balanced innovation. His observations about community interdependence reinforced the importance of relationships beyond property boundaries. Most valuable were his entries about family conflicts in earlier generations, disagreements between his father and uncles, tensions over modernization versus tradition, the eternal balance between economic viability and agricultural values. The Peterson farm had survived these challenges before adapting without surrendering its essential character. 2 years after Grandpa's death, the transformed property had found a new equilibrium. The commercial area provided economic stability that helped support the agricultural operations. The conservation buffer protected water quality and wildlife while educating visitors about ecological services. The working farm continued producing food while preserving agricultural knowledge and heritage. The Peterson family, too, had found a kind of reconciliation, if not complete healing. My father worked alongside me several days each week, his experience complementing my education. Uncle David visited occasionally. His health improved along with his conscience after his testimony had helped expose the truth. Even Uncle Martin maintained a professional cordiality when our paths crossed at community functions. The compromised outcome wasn't the total victory I had initially sought, but it reflected the complex reality of rural America, a place navigating between tradition and change, preservation and development, individual rights and community needs. The perfect solution had proven impossible, but a workable one had emerged from conflict. On the anniversary of finding the hidden will, I visited the workshop alone, opening the corn seed drawer that had changed everything. Inside, alongside the carefully preserved heritage varieties Grandpa had collected, I placed a small container with seeds from our first harvest. After the settlement, physical proof that life continues, adapts, and flourishes even after profound disruption. The farm had been diminished in size but strengthened in purpose. Its legacy continued not just in acreage, but in knowledge shared in community, supported in balance maintained between human needs and natural systems. Different than before, but still true to its essential character. As I closed the seed drawer, I reflected on what Grandpa's foresight had taught me, that preserving something valuable sometimes requires hiding it, where others won't think to look. That victory sometimes means compromise. That legacy continues through adaptation rather than rigid preservation. The seeds we save define the crops we grow. The truths we protect shape the future we create. The battles worth fighting aren't always won completely, but fighting them defines who we are and what we value. Grandpa understood this when he hid his true will in the humble drawer among the seeds that represented both heritage and possibility. The farm had a different shape now, but its heart remained intact. As long as seeds were saved and planted, as long as knowledge was preserved and shared, as long as the connection between people and land was maintained, the true inheritance continued not just as property but as purpose. Outside, the spring wheat was emerging in perfect rows across the south field, reaching towards sunlight with the same determination that had sustained life here for generations. Different boundaries, different challenges, but the same essential rhythm of growth and renewal that defined this place long before legal documents attempted to contain it. This was the real victory, not ownership, but stewardship. Not possession, but participation in something larger than individual lives or legal battles. The farm continued changed, but undefeated, diminished but determined, a living legacy that would outlast all our human dramas if we continued to care for it properly. In the end, what mattered wasn't winning or losing, but understanding what was truly worth fighting for. Not just land, but the relationship with land that defines us. Not just property, but the purpose it serves in our lives and community. Grandpa had known this all along. Now I did too.